I didn't go to the company retreat expecting anything good to happen. I went because not going would have looked worse. I learned that lesson the hard way. In our company, absence was treated like guilt. Presence, at least, gave you a chance to survive. So I packed a weekend bag, rehearsed neutral smiles in the mirror, and told myself the same thing I'd been telling myself for 3 years. Keep your head down, do the work, don't give anyone a reason. For context, I'm not invisible at my job. I'm just convenient. I'm the guy people come to when something's broken and needs fixing quietly. The one who stays late, rewrites decks at midnight, patches holes no one wants their name on. My performance reviews were always solid. My promotions were always next cycle. And there was always one person standing between me and anything better. Ethan. That wasn't his real power. His real power was tone. He joked the right way. He humiliated people with a smile and made it sound like encouragement. Leadership loved him because he made meetings feel lighter, especially when someone else was the punchline. Usually, that someone was me. The retreat was at a lakeside resort, 2 hours outside the city. Open bar, trust exercises, breakout sessions with words like alignment and vision printed on laminated cards. I noticed Ethan immediately. He was already in the center of a group, arm draped over a director's chair, telling a story that had everyone laughing just a second too late. I caught my name once, floating through the air like a balloon someone had let go of. Laughter followed. I pretended not to hear it. I told myself it was fine. It always started like that. The first session was a team challenge, mixed groups, assigned roles, public problem solving. I got put on Ethan's team. Of course I did. He grinned when he saw the list, like the weekend had just improved. We were supposed to present a solution by the end of the afternoon. Ethan talked a lot. I worked. I outlined risks, flagged assumptions, suggested a structure that actually made sense. He nodded along, then rephrased my points louder, smoother, and somehow they sounded like his. No one questioned it. No one ever did. At lunch, I overheard him talking to a VP near the buffet. He's great with execution, Ethan said, gesturing vaguely in my direction without looking at me. Not really a big-picture guy, but super reliable. I stood there holding a plate I no longer wanted. That line wasn't new. It was his favorite way of shrinking people without technically lying. By the afternoon session, I felt that familiar pressure behind my eyes. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. Awareness. I started paying attention to the details I usually ignored. Who was watching, who was taking notes, which facilitators were hovering near, leadership instead of teams. I noticed the board liaison had joined quietly, sitting in the back with a tablet, not participating. I noticed HR had brought an external consultant I didn't recognize, and then Ethan clapped his hands and said, "Why don't you walk everyone through your thought process?" The way he said it made my stomach drop. Too pleasant. Too public. I stood up anyway. I explained the model. I kept it tight. I didn't ramble. Halfway through, Ethan interrupted with a laugh. "Sorry, can we pause? I think this is a great example of overengineering. You see this a lot with people who get stuck in the weeds." A few people laughed. Not all. "Enough." He turned to the room. "This is why we need to think more strategically, right?" I felt my face flush, but my hands stayed steady. I finished, sat down, and didn't say another word. Inside, something clicked into place. This wasn't a joke. It wasn't a misunderstanding. He was setting a record, and records, once public, tend to stick. I didn't know it yet, but that moment, the exact wording he chose, the timing, the people in the room, was the mistake he'd been getting away with for years. And it told me something else, too. This wasn't going to end the way it usually did. The rest of that afternoon moved faster, like the air had thinned and everything was slightly sharper. People avoided my eyes. A few gave me that tight, sympathetic smile that means, "I saw it, but I'm not touching this." Ethan, on the other hand, was energized. He kept the room warm, joking about healthy debate. making it sound like what just happened was collaborative friction instead of a public teardown. At one point, the facilitator asked for feedback on team dynamics. Ethan didn't miss a beat. "I think we've got a great mix," he said. "Some people are execution-focused, others are more visionary." He paused just long enough for the implication to land. No names, no accusations, just a clean narrative. I watched a few heads nod. That was when it stopped feeling personal. Because if this were just about ego, he wouldn't have needed witnesses. He wouldn't have chosen that room, that tone, that timing. He was shaping how I was perceived, not just for the weekend, but for whatever decisions came next. And suddenly, a few things from the past year snapped into alignment. The delayed promotion, the reassigned credit, the way my name kept drifting out of conversations right before outcomes were decided. After the session ended, I stepped outside to clear my head. The lake looked calm in a way that felt almost mocking. I checked my phone. 3 Slack messages from people on other teams asking if I was good. One from a manager I trusted asking if we could talk later. No message from Ethan. He didn't need to check in. From his perspective, the move had landed clean. Dinner that night was worse. Assigned seating, long tables, wine already poured, leadership clustered near the center. I was 2 seats away from Ethan, close enough to hear him lean in and whisper commentary during speeches. Every time someone mentioned strategic alignment, he glanced at me with a smirk that only I could see. When the VP of Operations toasted the people who make this place run, Ethan raised his glass and said, "Unsung heroes," like it was a joke we shared. I didn't react. I didn't give him that. But inside, I was running inventory. Who had heard what? Who had laughed? Who had stayed silent? The board liaison was still there, listening more than talking. The external consultant from HR hadn't said a word all day, but I'd noticed her writing things down when Ethan interrupted me earlier. Not theatrically, methodically. That night, back in my room, I replayed the moment over and over. Not emotionally, but structurally. His phrasing, the way he framed my work as a pattern, not an instance. That's how reputations get rewritten. Slowly, then all at once. I opened my laptop and did something I'd avoided for a long time. I pulled up old project docs, meeting notes, Slack threads, not to defend myself, to understand the shape of what had been happening around me. And the more I looked, the clearer it became. I wasn't just being sidelined. I was being positioned. There were decisions tied to my projects that hadn't made sense at the time. Risky shortcuts approved without review. Numbers smoothed over in ways that were technically explainable, but strategically dangerous. Every time I'd push back, Ethan had stepped in to simplify, to keep things moving, to make sure leadership didn't get bogged down in details. My details. And now, at the retreat, he'd done it again. Only this time, in front of the wrong mix of people. The next morning started with a workshop on radical candor. The irony wasn't lost on me. Ethan leaned into it hard, talking about accountability, about how feedback was a gift. He looked straight at me once and said, "Sometimes people confuse thoroughness with value." I nodded, took notes, let him talk, but something had shifted. I wasn't trying to survive the weekend anymore. I was trying to understand the system I was standing in, the one he'd been gaming so confidently. And I realized that if he'd gone to this much trouble to define me publicly, it meant one thing. He needed me exactly where I was. By the 3rd morning, I stopped feeling angry. That was the part that scared me a little. Not because I wanted to lash out, but because clarity had replaced the noise. Anger makes you sloppy. Clarity makes you patient. I skipped breakfast and took my coffee out to the dock behind the resort. My laptop stayed closed. I didn't need more data. I needed to decide who I was going to be for the rest of this. Up until then, I'd played the role they'd assigned me, the fixer, the quiet one, the guy who absorbs impact so other people can look polished. It had kept me employed, respected in private, invisible in public, and Ethan had learned to use that. He didn't attack me head on. He leaned on my restraint, counted on it. What he didn't count on was me stepping out of that role without making a scene. The morning session was a leadership simulation. Realistic scenarios, fake stakes, but very real observers. The board liaison was there again. So was the HR consultant. The facilitator explained the exercise. Each group would respond to a sudden operational failure using limited information. Speed mattered. Confidence mattered. Ethan volunteered to lead before anyone else could speak. He always did. I watched him take control the way a magician handles a deck. Confident hands, relaxed smile. He started delegating immediately, skipping over questions, reframing uncertainties as details that could be handled later. The room leaned toward him. It usually did. When he turned to me, it wasn't to ask for input. It was to assign execution. Can you sanity check the numbers while we align on direction? Translation. Find the problems quietly. Don't interrupt the narrative. I said yes. And then I did something different. I documented everything, not theatrically, not in a way that slowed the group. I asked questions when it was appropriate, clarifying ones, the kind that forced someone to either answer precisely or reveal their hand-waving. When Ethan redirected, I didn't argue. I noted it. When assumptions were made without validation, I flagged them neutrally and moved on. To anyone watching casually, it probably looked like cooperation. To anyone trained to look for patterns, it looked like contrast. Halfway through, the facilitator paused us and asked Ethan to explain the rationale behind a key decision. He gave a smooth answer, confident, vague, forward-looking, the kind that usually satisfies. The consultant asked a follow-up. Based on which data point? There was a beat. Not long, just long enough. Ethan gestured toward me. He ran the numbers. Every head turned. I didn't rush. I didn't correct him directly. I just said, I reviewed the inputs we were given. That scenario wasn't supported by them. Silence. I followed it with specifics. Calm, factual, no tone, no judgment. Just the gap between what had been claimed and what actually existed. The facilitator thanked me and moved us forward. Ethan didn't look at me for the rest of the exercise. That afternoon, I got a message from the manager who'd checked on me the day before. We stepped into a quiet corner near the conference rooms. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He asked what I was seeing. So I told him, carefully, not a rant, a sequence. I didn't accuse Ethan of malice. I described behavior, patterns, outcomes. I explained how certain shortcuts looked efficient but created exposure. I explained why my concerns had always stayed low-key, because raising them loudly had consequences I couldn't afford. He listened longer than I expected. At the end, he said, "You should write this down." That was the moment I understood what this actually was. This wasn't about pride, or revenge, or even justice in the dramatic sense. This was about risk, and Ethan had been managing his own reputation by transferring risk downward, onto people like me, onto systems no one wanted to look at too closely. That night, the retreat schedule loosened. Drinks by the fire pit. Laughter. Music. Ethan was back in his element, telling stories, holding court. I stayed on the edge of it, present but unremarkable. Inside, though, something had broken cleanly. I wasn't trying to be liked anymore. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was simply done protecting someone who wouldn't hesitate to sacrifice me if it kept his image intact. As I turned in for the night, my phone buzzed. A calendar invite. Private. No description. Sent by HR. I stared at it for a long second before accepting. They thought I was still reacting. They didn't realize I'd already moved past that. And once you stop reacting, you start choosing. The following morning felt different. The retreat had ended for most people by noon, and the usual post-event mingling was in full swing. People were talking about what a great time they'd had, how much they'd learned, and the excitement of the next quarter. Everyone was buzzing, but I stayed quiet, letting the chatter fade into background noise. As I walked back to my room to gather my things, I felt it. The tension, thin and almost imperceptible, wrapping itself around my every step. The board liaison was still around, but I didn't see him near the exit like everyone else. Instead, he was talking to HR, who was flanked by the external consultant from yesterday. The conversation was more than idle chatter. I paused, just out of their line of sight, watching as the consultant leaned forward to hand something over to HR. There were no smiles, no polite exchanges, just sharp, purposeful movements. Then HR nodded and turned toward the main building, gesturing toward the director's office. I didn't need to be told where they were going. The door clicked shut behind me as I entered my room, and I sat down on the bed, staring at the same screen I had been looking at for hours the previous day. This time, I didn't open my laptop. I didn't need to. The decisions were already being made. The pieces were already in motion. It was time. I wasn't just watching events unfold anymore. I was part of them. This time, the system that had been used against me was about to be used against Ethan. But it wasn't going to be a dramatic big reveal. No scene, no explosions. It would be clean, efficient. I spent the next hour drafting an email. I didn't need to say much. Just the facts, just the gaps, the discrepancies, the decisions that were being made with the kind of blind confidence that only a few people could afford. People like Ethan, who knew how to smile at a room and leave behind a trail of forgotten truths. I clicked send. It was 11:30 a.m. when I submitted the report. By 1 p.m., I had already checked out. I didn't linger, didn't waste a second more than necessary. I grabbed my bags and took one last look at the place that had hosted my public humiliation just a few days ago. The lake, calm and quiet, the glassy surface reflecting a sky that hadn't changed at all since I'd first arrived. But I had. I was no longer the guy who let things slide. I wasn't the guy trying to keep the peace at any cost. And I wasn't the guy who let someone like Ethan rewrite my worth for the benefit of their own ego. By the time I reached the airport, the next phase was already in motion. The first reply came in just before I boarded the plane. It was from HR. They thanked me for the detailed breakdown. They appreciated the clarity. They would be following up with me upon my return to the office. I didn't reply. It wasn't necessary. The wheels were already turning. Ethan would soon realize that his charm had run out, and the carefully constructed image of him as the go-to guy was crumbling under the weight of facts. The decisions he'd made, the gaps he'd created, the risks he'd pushed onto others, it was all going to be exposed, methodically, quietly, and above all, thoroughly. I didn't need to watch. I didn't need to wait for the fallout. I already knew how this would end. The next week, Ethan was called into an emergency meeting. From what I gathered, it wasn't just a chat anymore. Internal audits, reports, and a few key unofficial questions had started making their rounds, and this time he couldn't talk his way out of it. By Thursday, his desk had been cleared, his access revoked, and his departure quietly processed. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't loud, but it was final. And me? I walked into the office that morning holding a fresh promotion letter in hand. Not a reward for fighting back, not for making a scene, but for showing the kind of integrity this company only acknowledged when it suited them. That afternoon, my manager came by to congratulate me. He didn't ask me what had happened with Ethan, didn't need to. He knew I'd done what I had to do, and that was all that mattered. The details, the back and forth, the drama of it all. It was irrelevant. For the first time in years, I finally felt what it was like to be in control of my own story. The office didn't explode when I came back. There were no whispers following me down the hall. No dramatic stares. That was the strangest part. For years, everything around Ethan had felt performative. His exit wasn't. His name simply stopped coming up. His calendar invites vanished. His projects were reassigned without commentary. People spoke carefully for a while, like they'd just walked through a room where something fragile had shattered and no one wanted to admit they'd heard it break. Officially, he'd pursued opportunities outside the company. Unofficially, everyone understood what that phrase meant when legal was involved. I was asked to meet with the board liaison 2 days later. Not alone. HR was present, and so was someone from internal audit. The meeting wasn't adversarial. It wasn't congratulatory either. It was procedural. They asked me to walk through my work, my decisions, my documentation. They didn't ask how Ethan made me feel. They asked why certain risks hadn't been escalated earlier. And I answered honestly. I told them the truth most people never say out loud, that escalation has a cost, and the cost isn't evenly distributed, that some people can afford to be challenging, and others learn quickly that being right isn't the same as being safe. No one interrupted me, no one defended him. At the end, the liaison nodded once and said, "That's changing." My new role came with a different title, different visibility, and, quietly, different protection. I wasn't suddenly fearless. I was just no longer alone. That matters more than people think. A week later, I ran into someone from the retreat in the break room. They hesitated, then said, "I keep thinking about that moment when he cut you off. It didn't sit right." They looked relieved, saying it, like naming it released something they'd been holding. That's when I understood the last piece of it. What ended Ethan wasn't my email, or my notes, or even the audit. It was the pattern. He'd relied on everyone staying silent at the same time. And silence is fragile when it's shared. I still do the work. I still fix things. But I don't shrink anymore. I don't let people define me with jokes or half sentences. And when I speak now, people listen. Not because I'm louder, but because I'm precise. Sometimes I think back to that afternoon at the retreat, the way he smiled when he thought he was in control. I don't feel satisfaction. I feel calm. And that's better. Because the truth is, I didn't win by beating him at his own game. I won by refusing to keep playing it.